What if the years you've been taught to fear are actually the ones holding your most profound purpose? What if everything our culture whispers about aging, the decline, the irrelevance, the slow fade into meaninglessness, is not truth, but a carefully constructed lie that keeps you from accessing the deepest reservoir of meaning available to the human spirit? Viktor Frankl stood in the ashes of humanity's darkest hour and discovered something our modern world has violently forgotten, that suffering is not the end of significance but often its beginning, and aging, that inevitable march we all resist with cosmetics and fear, may be the suffering our era refuses to transform into meaning. You've been conditioned to believe that youth holds all the answers, that vitality equals value, that wrinkles are warnings of worthlessness. But what if you've had it backwards this entire time? There exists a hidden opportunity embedded in every gray hair, every stiffening joint, every moment you feel the weight of years accumulating on your shoulders, an opportunity that 20-year-olds cannot access, that the young and restless cannot even perceive. Frankl called it the tragic optimism, the capacity to extract meaning from the unavoidable, to alchemize loss into wisdom, limitation into liberation. Our culture sells you retirement as an ending, but what if it's actually an invitation to finally ask the questions you've been too busy to confront, to pursue the purposes you've been too distracted to notice, to become the person you were always meant to be once all the noise falls away. Every person who dismisses their older years as irrelevant is unknowingly rejecting the very stage of life where meaning becomes most accessible, most urgent, most real. But here's what they'll never tell you in the anti-aging commercials, the wellness retreats, the fountain of youth fantasies flooding your screen. The crisis isn't in your aging body, it's in your shrinking sense of purpose. And Frankl, who watched men twice his age find reasons to survive another day in concentration camps while younger men surrendered to despair, knew something that could shatter every assumption you hold about what it means to grow old. He knew that meaning doesn't decrease with age. It concentrates. It distills. It becomes undeniable. The question isn't whether you're getting older. The question is whether you're brave enough to discover what only older eyes can see, what only tested hearts can hold, what only those who've accumulated years can finally understand. And if you turn away now, you'll miss the single insight that could transform every remaining day from a countdown into a calling. You were never supposed to question what aging means. Society handed you a script before you could even read it. Grow up, be productive, peak somewhere in your 30s or 40s, then gracefully step aside while the world moves on without you. But Viktor Frankl didn't survive Auschwitz by accepting the scripts handed to him. He survived by discovering that meaning isn't something the world gives you. It's something you wrest from the world, especially when the world insists you have nothing left to offer. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants you to consider. The moment you internalize the belief that your best years are behind you, you don't just stop living, you start dying while still breathing. The crisis of aging isn't biological, it's existential. And it begins the second you mistake the end of one kind of usefulness for the end of all purpose. There's a peculiar violence in how we treat the aging process, a kind of cultural erasure that Frankl would have recognized immediately. We don't just ignore older people, we actively teach them to ignore themselves. We flood them with messages that their stories don't matter, their wisdom is outdated, their presence is a burden rather than a gift. And slowly, insidiously, they begin to believe it. They begin to shrink, not just physically but spiritually, emotionally, existentially. They stop asking the questions that matter because they've been convinced that their questions no longer matter. But Frankl understood something most never grasp, that the capacity to find meaning doesn't diminish with age. It actually requires age. It requires the accumulated weight of experience, the confrontation with limitation, the intimacy with loss that only years can provide. Consider what happens when someone retires. The world celebrates it as freedom, as the reward for decades of labor, as the golden years finally arriving. But what does that person often experience? A sudden, terrifying void. The identity they built over 40 years evaporates overnight. The alarm clock that once defined their rhythm goes silent. The colleagues who filled their days disappear. And in that silence, in that absence, a question emerges that they've been too busy to hear their entire lives. Who am I when I'm no longer useful in the way I've always been useful? Frankl would tell you that this question isn't the problem. It's the gateway. It's the doorway to a kind of meaning that most people never access because they never stop moving long enough to walk through it. But you have to be willing to stand in that doorway. You have to be willing to feel the vertigo of not knowing. And here's where it gets dangerous, where the real tension lives. Most people would rather numb themselves than face that question. They'd rather fill the void with distractions, routines, small comforts that keep them from feeling the full weight of their own existence. Because feeling it means confronting everything they've avoided, every unlived life still pulsing beneath the surface, every dream they sacrificed for security, every voice they silenced to fit in. Aging strips away the excuses. It removes the buffer of time. It forces you to admit that if you're going to live a life of meaning, it has to be now, not someday, not when conditions are perfect. Now. And that realization is either liberating or devastating, depending on whether you're brave enough to act on it. Frankl wrote about the existential vacuum, that gnawing sense of meaninglessness that pervades modern life, and nowhere is it more visible than in how we've constructed the narrative around aging. We've turned it into a problem to be solved rather than a stage to be inhabited. We've medicalized it, commercialized it, pathologized it until the natural process of growing older feels like a disease that needs curing. But what if the real disease isn't aging itself? It's the refusal to let aging mean something. What if the wrinkles on your face are actually a map of every moment you've survived, every tear you've shed, every laugh that shook your body? What if your slower pace isn't decline but deepening, not weakness but wisdom learning to walk at its own speed? There's a story Frankl tells, though not in these exact words, about the difference between those who survive suffering and those who succumb to T. It's never about the severity of the suffering itself. It's about whether the person can find a reason, any reason, to endure it. He watched men in the camps who had everything stripped away, their families, their homes, their names, their hair, their dignity. And yet some of them, against all logic, found reasons to keep living. A book they wanted to finish writing, a child they hoped might still be alive, a task they felt only they could complete. The reason didn't have to be grand, it just had to be real. And aging operates on the same principle. The person who can find meaning in their older years doesn't experience aging the same way as the person who can't. They're living in entirely different realities, even if their bodies are going through the same processes. But here's what makes this so difficult, so emotionally complex. Finding meaning in aging requires you to confront everything you've been running from. It requires you to sit with regret without letting it consume you. It requires you to acknowledge loss without denying it. It requires you to feel the full weight of your mortality without collapsing under it. Most people can't do this. They look back and see only mistakes, only missed opportunities, only versions of themselves they'll never become. And that backward glance becomes a prison. Frankl would say that the past can't be changed, but it can be redeemed. Every choice you made, even the ones that hurt you or others, contributed to making you who you are right now. And who you are right now still has the capacity to create meaning, to affect lives, to leave something behind that matters. The tension here is almost unbearable if you're honest about it, because to embrace aging as an opportunity means accepting that you can't go back and fix what's broken. You can't retrieve the years you wasted. You can't undo the harm you caused or the love you refused. You have to carry all of it forward and somehow transform it into something that serves a purpose beyond your own pain. And that transformation isn't optional if you want to live rather than merely exist. It's the work. It's the only work that matters. And it's work that only gets more urgent, more pressing, more unavoidable with each passing year. You either do it or you spend your remaining time haunted by everything you refuse to face. There's a moment Frankl describes, a moment many miss entirely, when suffering stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you can choose to give meaning. It's a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it changes everything. You move from victim to author, from passive recipient of pain to active creator of purpose. And aging, with all its inevitable losses and limitations, offers this exact opportunity. But you have to see it. You have to recognize that every limitation is also an invitation to focus on what remains, to pour your energy into what still matters, to finally separate the essential from the trivial. When you can no longer do everything, you're forced to choose what's worth doing. And that choice, that deliberate selection of where to invest your dwindling time and energy, is where meaning lives. Think about the people who've inspired you most deeply. Were they the youngest, the strongest, the most physically impressive? Or were they the ones who carried a certain quality in their eyes, a depth that suggested they'd seen things, survived things, understood things that can't be taught in classrooms or learned from books. There's a gravitas that only comes from years lived with intention, from suffering metabolized into wisdom, from mistakes acknowledged and integrated rather than denied. Frankl embodied this. He didn't just theorize about meaning, he demonstrated it by building a life and a body of work that helped millions find purpose in their own suffering. And he did much of his most influential work in the second half of his life, the half our culture would dismiss as declining, as past prime, as less valuable. But here's the trap, the place where most people get stuck. They wait for aging to feel meaningful before they're willing to engage with it. They want the wisdom without the wrinkles, the depth without the difficulty, the transformation without the pain, and it doesn't work that way. Meaning isn't something you find lying around like a coin on the sidewalk. It's something you forge in the fire of lived experience. It's something you create by choosing to respond to your circumstances rather than merely react to them. When your body slows down, you can resent it, or you can use it as an opportunity to finally pay attention to what your body has been trying to tell you for years. When your career ends, you can mourn it, or you can ask what you were really serving all along, and whether there's a deeper version of that service still available to you. And this is where the real work begins, the work that makes some people's later years radiant with purpose, while others fade into bitterness and resignation. You have to be willing to ask the questions that have no easy answers. What was I put here to do that only I can do? What unique constellation of experiences, wounds, gifts, and insights do I carry that someone, somewhere needs? What would I regret not giving, not saying, not creating before I die? These aren't comfortable questions. They don't lead to neat, tidy conclusions, but they lead to life, real life. The kind of life that Frankl insisted was always possible, even in a concentration camp, even in old age, even when everything external suggests you should give up. Because meaning isn't about your circumstances, it's about your response to your circumstances. And that response is always within your control. Frankl talked about the will to meaning as the primary drive of human existence, more fundamental than pleasure, more powerful than the will to power. And nowhere is this will tested more rigorously than in the final chapters of life. When pleasure becomes harder to access, when power has already been wielded or forever lost, what remains? Only meaning. Only the question of whether your existence, in this exact form, with these exact limitations, still matters. And the brutal truth is that it only matters if you make it matter. Nobody's going to hand you a certificate of significance just for accumulating years. Nobody's going to validate your worth just because you've survived. You have to claim it. You have to insist on it. You have to build it with the raw materials of your remaining days. There's something almost sacred about the way older people who've found their purpose carry themselves. They're not trying to prove anything anymore. They're not competing or performing or pretending. They've arrived at a kind of authenticity that can only come from facing your own mortality and deciding that even in its shadow, life is worth living fully. They've made peace with what they can't change and made choices about what they can. They've stopped waiting for permission and started living from a deeper authority, an internal compass that no longer needs external validation. This is what our culture is terrified of. People who don't need its approval. People who've found meaning outside its narrow definitions of success and relevance. People who look at aging not as a tragedy, but as a privilege denied to those who died young. But getting there requires walking through fire. It requires facing every illusion you've built about who you are and why you matter. It requires admitting that much of what you thought was important was actually just noise, distraction, ego dressed up as purpose. It requires the humility to say you don't know what comes next, but you're willing to find out. And it requires the courage to act on what you discover, even if it means disappointing people, even if it means starting something new when everyone expects you to wind down, even if it means admitting you spent decades living someone else's version of your life, and now you want to try living your own. This is the opportunity Frankl saw. This is the opening that aging creates. But you have to be willing to walk through it rather than around it. And here's what nobody tells you. The people who do this, who turn their aging into an opportunity for meaning rather than a slow surrender to irrelevance, they don't just change their own lives, they change everyone around them. They become permission for others to question the script, to resist the cultural narrative, to imagine that maybe, just maybe, their later years could be the most meaningful ones. They become proof that it's possible. And in a world drowning in youth worship and age denial, That kind of proof is revolutionary. It's dangerous. It threatens the entire system that profits from making people feel worthless after 50, 60, 70. Because if older people discovered their actual power, their accumulated wisdom, their hard-won perspective, and decided to use it, everything would change. Frankl believed that humans could endure almost any suffering if they could see a meaning in it. But he also knew that meaning isn't always obvious. Sometimes it has to be excavated from beneath layers of pain, disappointment, and despair. Sometimes it requires looking at your life from an entirely different angle, asking different questions, being willing to see patterns you've been blind to. And aging forces this excavation whether you're ready or not. It strips away the superficial. It removes the masks you've worn so long you forgot they were masks. It puts you face to face with yourself in a way that youth, with all its distractions and possibilities, never does. And in that confrontation, you have a choice. Turn away or lean in. Deny or discover. Numb or feel. The people who choose to lean in, who allow aging to break them open rather than shut them down, they access something most never touch. They access the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. They access the clarity that comes from knowing time is finite. They access the love that comes from realizing that connection matters more than achievement, presence more than productivity, being more than doing. But this doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen just because you get older. It happens because you choose it again and again, in small moments and large ones, in the face of pain, and in the presence of beauty, when you're alone, and when you're witnessed. It's a practice. It's a discipline. It's a way of meeting life that Frankl called tragic optimism, the ability to say yes to life despite everything, to find meaning not in spite of suffering but sometimes because of it. And this is where the story gets personal, where it stops being abstract philosophy and becomes about you, right now, in this moment. What have you been telling yourself about aging? What fears have you been carrying? What dreams have you dismissed because you think you're too old, too tired, too late? Frankl would ask you, too late for what? Too late according to whom? The culture that benefits from your resignation? The industries that profit from your insecurity? The voices, external and internal, that need you to stay small so they can stay comfortable? Or too late according to the deepest truth of your own existence, the part of you that knows has always known that you're not finished, that you have something left to give, that your story isn't over until you say it is. There's a violence in how we bury this knowledge, how we silence the voice that insists on meaning, even when meaning seems impossible. We do it to ourselves and we do it to each other. We tell people to retire gracefully, to not make trouble, to accept their diminished role, to be grateful for what they had rather than hungry for what's still possible. And some people comply. They fold themselves into smaller and smaller spaces until they disappear entirely, not in death but in a kind of living death where they go through motions but feel nothing, where they exist but don't live, where they breathe but don't hope. And Frankl would say, this is the real tragedy, not aging, not death, but the refusal to live fully until the very end, the refusal to believe that meaning is possible right now, in this body, at this age, with these limitations and these gifts. What if every year you've lived has been preparing you for right now? What if every failure, every loss, every moment you thought was wasted was actually building something you couldn't see at the time? A foundation for a kind of meaning that's only accessible now, in this season of life, with this particular combination of experience and awareness. Frankl would tell you that nothing is wasted if you can extract meaning from it. Nothing is beyond redemption if you're willing to look at it honestly and ask what it taught you, how it shaped you, what it revealed about yourself or others or the nature of existence itself. This is the alchemy of meaning-making. This is how you turn lead into gold, suffering into wisdom, aging into awakening. But it requires something most people won't give: radical honesty. You have to stop lying to yourself about what you want, what you fear, what you're avoiding, what you're longing for. You have to stop performing for an audience that isn't even watching anymore. You have to stop waiting for someone to give you permission to live the way you actually want to live. And this is terrifying, because it means taking full responsibility for the shape of your remaining years. It means admitting that if you're bored, it's because you've accepted boredom. If you're lonely, it's because you've stopped reaching out. If you're purposeless, it's because you haven't done the work of discovering what your purpose might be now, in this chapter, with what you have rather than what you wish you had. Frankl spent years in camps watching people make choices that determined whether they survived or perished, and the choices were often small, almost invisible to outside observers. One man would share his last piece of bread. Another would comfort a dying stranger. Another would hold on to hope for one more day because he wanted to see a particular sunset. These weren't grand gestures. They were tiny acts of meaning-making in the midst of absolute horror. And aging asks the same of you. Not grand gestures, not dramatic transformations. Just the daily choice to show up, to care, to create, to connect, to believe that what you do with your time matters even if nobody's applauding, even if nobody's watching, even if the only witness is your own soul recognizing that it's still alive, still engaged, still growing. And so the question becomes not whether aging is difficult. Of course it's difficult, but whether you're willing to let that difficulty mean something, whether you're willing to let it teach you, shape you, refine you, whether you're willing to become the person who meets their final years with curiosity rather than dread, with purpose rather than resignation, with love rather than bitterness, because that person exists in you. That potential is there. It's been there all along, waiting for the moment when you'd finally be ready to claim it. And maybe that moment is now. Maybe this is what you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. Not a magic solution, not a way to reverse time, but a way to inhabit time differently, to make the years that remain count in ways the years that passed didn't, to finally live like you mean it. So here you stand, at the edge of everything you thought you knew about what your life could mean from here forward. Viktor Frankl didn't survive the unsurvivable to tell you that meaning is easy to find. He survived to prove that it's always possible to find, even when every external condition screams otherwise. And if meaning was possible in the shadow of death, in the depths of absolute despair, then it's certainly possible now, in your aging body, with your accumulating years, with your so-called limitations that are actually liberations in disguise. The opportunity isn't coming someday when you feel ready, when conditions improve, when you've figured it all out. The opportunity is the fact that you're still here, still breathing, still capable of choosing what your remaining time will mean. And that choice made in this moment and every moment after is the difference between fading away and burning bright until the very end. What will you carry with you when you close this video? Will it be the same resignation you brought with you? The same tired story about decline and irrelevance and being past your prime? Or will something else walk out with you? A question you can't stop asking, a possibility you can't unsee, a whisper of truth that refuses to be silenced. Because once you've glimpsed the reality that aging can be an invitation rather than an ending, you can't fully return to innocence. You can pretend you didn't hear it. You can bury it under distractions and routines and all the comfortable lies, but it will still be there, waiting, asking, insisting that you have more to give, more to become, more to discover about who you are when everything false has been stripped away. Frankl would tell you that this discomfort, this unsettling sense that you're being called to something you don't yet understand, is precisely the feeling that precedes every meaningful transformation. The years ahead are unwritten pages, and you're holding the pen whether you realize it or not. Every day you wake up is another opportunity to inscribe meaning onto time, to turn breath into purpose, to transform the inevitable march toward death into a journey toward something that outlasts your physical presence. This isn't optimism. This isn't denial. This is the tragic optimism that Frankl embodied, the ability to face reality exactly as it is, with all its pain and limitation and loss, and still say yes to life, still choose meaning, still insist that what you do matters, not because anyone told you it matters, not because society validates it, but because you've decided, from the deepest place within you, that you will not waste whatever time remains on resentment, fear, or the slow death of resignation. If this struck something in you, if something shifted even slightly in how you see your own aging, then don't let this moment evaporate into the noise of your feed. Leave a comment sharing what you're choosing to make meaningful in this season of your life, not for me, but for yourself, to make the commitment real, to speak it into existence. Hit that like button if you're ready to stop accepting the cultural script about aging and start writing your own. Share this with someone who needs permission to believe their later years could be their most powerful ones. And subscribe, because this conversation is just beginning, and the next truth we uncover together might be the one that changes everything. You're not here by accident, you're here because something in you is still hungry for meaning. Don't ignore that hunger. Feed it.